In this video, we will be looking at the Anti-Corn Law League, a movement to help the poor and hungry in Britain. Alrighty, so first of all, just need to clarify that this isn't about the corn that you may be thinking of. In this case, corn refers to all cereal grains. That included barley, oats, but most importantly, wheat. Wheat was vital because it was used to make bread, and this was a staple food for most working people in Britain. The price of bread, therefore, was a matter of survival. So we're going to be looking at the 19th century again. And if we go back to 1815, Britain has just fought and won the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. During the war, trade with Europe was heavily disrupted, and so British farmers were the only farmers selling wheat to the British public. Once the war ended, people expected trade with Europe to begin again, and so with cheap foreign grains coming in, this would lower the price of food for the British public and life would go back to normal. However, the government passed something called the Corn Laws, which allowed them to control the price of food by putting taxes on foreign grains. And you may ask, why would they do this? Well, a lot of the politicians in Britain were very wealthy landowners, which meant that if the price of grain was higher, they would benefit from selling it. This would also benefit British farmers as well, because they did not need to compete with foreign farmers. But most people in Britain were very negatively affected, and sections of society wanted these laws removed. So a bit of economics here. For the workers who spent most of their wages on bread, the Corn Laws kept the price of food high and increased their cost of living, which was obviously bad. For the factory owners, they realised that because of high prices, they had to pay their workers more, and so this reduced the amount of profit they could make. They also knew that if people had less money to spend, it would be harder to sell their manufactured goods to the British people. Interestingly, this is one of the few times in history when you have this sort of alliance between the factory owners and also the workers, as they both opposed the Corn Laws. They saw this as a case where the land-owning politicians were putting their interests over the interests of the nation. So, what happened? Well, in 1839, a group called the Anti-Corn Law League was founded. This is what we call a single interest group, as their sole purpose was to pressure the government to repeal their corn laws. Some of the methods they used included signing and delivering petitions to government, thousands of anti-corn law speeches being made, and also articles in newspapers and journals being published. There is a very famous journal called The Economist, which still runs today, and they launched this journal to campaign for the repeal of the Corn Laws and for free trade. This was an economic idea that countries should be allowed to freely trade with each other without any extra taxes. Just like the Chartists and the abolitionist movement, the Anti-Corn Law League was a truly national movement. And the good thing about having the backing of the factory owners is that they had very wealthy businessmen to fund their activities. Two key leaders of the League would actually become members of Parliament. One was Richard Cobden, a businessman from Manchester, and in Parliament he argued that free trade would lower food prices and reduce poverty in Britain. Then you have John Bright, and he took a slightly more vengeful approach than Cobden's economic arguments, and he attacked the rich landlords in Parliament for this cruel system where the poor were forced to pay higher prices for bread. Then you have the Prime Minister, a man named Robert Peel. He was a founder and leader of the Conservative Party, which used to be the Tory party. Most of the politicians were these rich landlords, and so they benefited and wanted to keep the Corn Laws in place. However, Peel personally believed in free trade and wanted to get rid of the Corn Laws. An opportunity came in 1845 when the Great Potato Famine in Ireland began, which devastated the country, whose population fell by about a quarter, and still, even today, the population of Ireland hasn't fully recovered. But whilst the famine was going on, a moral argument was being made about why are we stopping cheap grain from coming in whilst there are people literally starving in Ireland. And so, Robert Peel abolished the Corn Laws in 1846, in the process splitting the Conservative Party and also ended his political career. So, the Corn Laws were repealed, but what then was the significance of the Anti-Corn Law League? First of all, this was the first time that the government acted in the interests of the poor instead of the wealthy landowners. A study found that the repeal of the Corn Laws benefited 90% of the people in Britain, whilst causing losses for the top 10% of income earners. This leads us onto the fact that unlike other movements like Chartism, the Anti-Corn Law League was actually successful at the time. It was probably the most successful pressure group of the 19th century, as the League was founded in 1839, and within only 7 years they had achieved their single aim. The repeal also brought immediate relief to the poor, as it reduced the price of food, which helped relieve hunger and poverty for millions in Britain. Then, in the long term, the League showed the power of public campaigns, inspiring more and more people to get into politics in the years and decades to come. The movement also showed Britain's transition towards free trade, getting rid of any taxes and barriers with other nations with trade. In the 1830s, with the Corn Laws, only a tiny amount of food was imported, but by the end of the 19th century, Britain was dependent on foreign imports, and the British Empire became a symbol of free trade across the world. That pretty much ends this topic, and in the next video, we will be looking at the organisation of workers with the birth of the trade union movement in Britain. See you then.